Got a D in history. I now know why I got that D. I always wondered why there were no black people in the history books. Nothing. And I knew that there was more to the story.
And oh, what a story.
They have to know.
Elaine Buck and Beverly Mills are longtime friends and lifelong residents of this predominantly white community, nestled in central Jersey's tranquil Hopewell Valley, and where they've discovered a rich history of African-American settlers dating back to the Revolutionary War and the enslaved Africans who preceded them.
This is our story in the Sourland Mountain region and Hopewell Valley, but this story, these narratives,
It's interchangeable. It's a national story.
Both women are trustees of the Stoutsburg Cemetery, a black cemetery that holds the remains and the stories of their ancestors and other families who call this region home.
Here's the Hoglands that we were talking about, and then there's some true hearts right there.
But it was the pending desecration of another African-American burial ground nearby that propelled these two then middle-aged women on a 15-year mission to rewrite history.
Some of the names that were given to us by the older white gentleman that called us and said that it was going to be destroyed, some of the names were Hoagland and Dowdy, and so we heard these names and we thought, these are our family names.
They stopped that desecration and launched a search for what lay beneath the stones in their own family plot, scouring news clippings and archives, court and public records, and the wills of white slave owners.
The said Negro calls himself Peter Waldron and pretends to be a free man. This Waldron, the Waldrons came in from Long Island, the white Waldrons, and brought their enslaved people with them and moved into these communities. My family name is Waldron.
Their discoveries most painful.
A cargo of likely Negroes just imported.
And all enlightening.
New Jersey was the last northern state to abolish slavery in 1804.
Collected in a book and curated in a museum inside the historic AME Zion Church in Skillman, Somerset County. Built in the late 1800s.
Albeit small, a thriving little church. And so we often heard the stories about the black community here.
It was a community that was home to descendants of the first enslaved people brought to this part of New Jersey, among them a teenager named Friday Trueheart, owned by the pastor of the still-standing Old School Baptist Church in nearby Hopewell.
My fourth great-grandfather.
Brought here as a slave.
Brought here as a slave at 13 years old by the Reverend Oliver Hart.
A revelation that underscored that their history had been ignored, or worse, omitted.
How do you go through 12 years in one of the best school systems in the state and never once hear that there was slavery in New Jersey, never once realize that there was slaves walking right in the area where I was living, that I was the descendant of slaves. It was never talked about. You don't learn about it in school.
Their meticulous research uncovered discharge papers for one William Stives, signed by one General George Washington.
He served with Washington for 5 years. He was at the Battle of Yorktown. He was at pivotal battles.
Stives' marker in the Stoutsburg Cemetery rests alongside black veterans of the Civil War.
They were at the procession for Lincoln when he died, and our troops were there, the 127 colored troops.
Men who fought for our country, others who fought their own private battles.
This is my great-grandfather. This is Earl Hubbard's dad.
A story passed down for generations was validated more than 120 years later by an associate professor at Rider, where Herbert Hubbard was indeed the first black graduate.
His degree was in stenography and bookkeeping, and he graduated in 1894.
Discoveries like that from America's earliest days take Elaine back to where this all began.
When I got to 9th grade, I finally asked, in front of the whole class, I asked the history teacher, I said, why do you keep showing us these white men with these ugly wigs? He looked at me, he said, to the office. So I got thrown out and I went to the office. But before I left, I said, now I know that black people did more than pick cotton and have babies. And there was nothing in the history books.
Well, there is now. Elaine and Beverly co-authored their own book, If the These Stones Could Talk, rooted in their findings at the Stoutsburg Cemetery.
My teacher's probably flipping out on the, on the ground now.
And they'll soon break ground on a new museum and education center on the plot of land next door.
America needs to know about the contributions of the African Americans, because without that contribution, America would not be what it is today at all. Once people have knowledge, once you understand the story, and I think that changes minds, and it can therefore perhaps, hopefully, change hearts.
And Gus, clearly, to say those two women are remarkable is an understatement. They started this project when they were in their 50s, spent 15 years amateur historians, and uncovered a history that they didn't even know existed in that region, much less the rest of us. I mean, even our photographer, Keith Feldman, our photojournalist who was with us that day, said to me, I didn't know there was slavery in New Jersey, and when in fact New Jersey was the last of the 13 colonies in the North to abolish slavery. And frankly, after that, there was still many, many years before it was completely, because of course we had indentured servants, if you will. It was really a remarkable story, and their book is fascinating. I've just started reading it again. It's called If These Stones Could Talk. I highly recommend it.
Great piece there, Pat. Thank you. And we'll be right back with more news after this.